Welcome to the second in a series of talks on Wesley's Britain by Jeremy Black, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Exeter, and also a visiting fellow with us in the Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History. Professor Black is one of Britain's most distinguished historians and one of its most prolific, having written more than 150 books. Professor Black's primary expertise is in the 18th century, so he's very well placed to give us a view of Wesley's Britain. And in this second talk, he's going to discuss the economy of 18th century Britain. So Jeremy, over to you.
As with the first talk, it's a question of where we place our emphasis, and placing our emphasis is never easy. In the case of Britain in the 18th century, there is the endless use of the term revolution. There is the financial revolution, there is the transport revolution, there is the agricultural revolution, and there is most clearly the industrial revolution. Now, I so happen to think that these are all significant, and they're all significant in Britain's modernity, contribution to modernization around the world. But I do not feel that they fully capture the complexity of developments in Britain. And more particularly, they don't really capture the timing. If we're looking at the timing of change, if we're looking at industrialization, for example, there were significant developments in the 18th century, particularly in cotton textiles, particularly in metallurgy. There was the greater application of steam power in pumping water out of mines, in processes such as glass making, sugar refining, but most of the use of steam-driven machinery comes in the 19th century. And the idea of the Industrial Revolution as characterizing the 18th century is particularly unhelpful for the first half of the 18th century. Transport, similarly. Much of what we associate with the transport revolution in terms of canals and in terms of turnpike roads are a matter, in the latter case, from the mid-century onwards. In the case of canals, a lot of the canals in the last third of the 18th century. These were important, but again, if you're looking at revolutionary change in terms of the movement of bulk goods in vast quantities at a relatively cheap price, that is made much easier with the railway. And although there are railways in the 18th century, these coal wagons pulled along them are pulled by horses. And it's only when you have the locomotive steam engine in the 19th century that you really change the situation. And the same at sea. The locomotive steamship, the steam engine in that context of a locomotive steam engine, a moving steam engine, is really a 19th century innovation. It is not used in the 18th century. In agricultural terms, there are important changes in the 18th century, and they've been much discussed. The Norfolk rotation, the use of legumes and other crops in order to fix nitrogen in the soil. But I think it's fair to say that well, what can one argue? I would argue that it's really, in terms of things like scientific breeding of animals, it really is more of a 19th century development. And so I would argue is the agricultural specialization, which means that due to refrigerated holds, large steamships, Britain is able to draw a lot of its meat supplies and its grain supplies from Australasia, Argentina, and North America. So I would argue that the revolution in the food base of the British is really 19th century. So if we are going to think in those terms, what one is rather talking about for the age of Wesley is changes that are significant, that gather pace, particularly after the late 1750s, but that do not succeed in capturing the term revolution, which is very much a later description of this period. Now, if we're not going to use the term revolution, what we should really be thinking about is a complicated process in which, instead of a technological silver bullet, whether that silver bullet is to be understood in terms of the steam engine or not, instead of a technological silver bullet, one should rather be thinking about changes between supply and demand factors and changes in terms of liquidity. Which are ones that are important? Well, firstly, in terms of both supply and demand, population growth in the 17th century had been modest. It had been considerable in the 16th century. It had then fallen off in the first half of the 17th century, which on the whole had been a difficult period for population. And I think it's fair to say that the early decades of the 18th century continued this process. Modest population growth until the 1740s, with periodic demographic emergencies, 1693 to 4, for example, or 1740 to 41, in which you get the combination of poor harvests and greater exposure to epidemic illnesses. Now, those being the case, what I think one could argue is that it is the change in the 1740s and 50s towards, how should one say it? It's the change in the 1740s and 50s towards a greater population and a greater rate of population growth, this is the latter being particularly significant, that provides additional demand. There are literally more people that have to be fed, that have to be clothed, but also more supply. There is more labor, and crucially, there is more young labor. And I think that's an important factor. The young labor gives you energy, it enables you human energy, human capital, it enables you to see a growth of activity in agriculture, industry, and trade without one crowding out the other. And the synergy of all three is important. It literally provides you with the manpower needed to hack larger and larger amounts of coal out of the ground. Incidentally, a process in which Britain did not import any slaves. So this being the case, I think what one could argue is that one should be looking and addressing factors that are complex, in which, when one is trying to explain not just why Britain grew, but why its economy increasingly diverged from that of the rest of Western and Central Europe. Now, there are several things one could argue here. One can argue that at a modest level, growth rates had, for example, in the use of coal, had gathered pace from the 16th century, that these growth rates in the use of coal were important because Britain had coal near the surface, it had coal near the coast, which meant that it could be readily moved, particularly from the major coal fields, the Tyneside and Wearside coalfield in the northeast of England. And that all of this contrasted with the situation in continental Europe, where many countries either had virtually no workable coal, Spain, Portugal, or not coal that was able to use in any significant quantities, France, for example. The other areas that you do see coal used, the Meuse Valley in Belgium, the Ruhr in what we would now call Germany, were not to be in the 18th century areas of major industrialization on the British scale, but were to be so on the 19th century. So Britain has an advantage of much greater use of coal, much greater availability of coal, and this is significant because it is using up a lot of its wood supplies. And if it hadn't had the bridge to coal, it is likely that that would have slowed down industrial change, because so much wood would have been required not just for industry, but for domestic fuel. So that is a factor I think one should make. Another factor I think one should make is the British engagement with overseas trade, which is greater than that of Britain's major commercial rivals, with the exception of the Dutch, the United Provinces. In France and Spain, there was, of course, important transoceanic trade, but not at the level of Britain. And in part, I think this is because the elite in both those countries was not as engaged in trade, nor were the capital cities, Paris and Madrid, which are insular cities, inland cities, nor were they so open to commercial lobbying. I think in Britain it is important that after the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 89, the establishment of the funded national debt centred on the Bank of England, established in 1694, and the regular accountability of government to Parliament and regularly elected parliaments, all of those help to make a political system that is particularly open to economic influences. And I think those are important, and those are worthy of attention. I think if one's looking at other factors, one could argue that the British intellectual tradition of that period was very much that of applied scientific knowledge, and that the British proved very interested in what you might regard as the new knowledge. Looking back to the Baconian ideas of the early 17th century, looking back to the way in which these had illuminated policy and attitudes during the mid-17th century, particularly the interregnum government, looking back to the role of the Royal Society after its foundation in 1660, and looking to the emphasis on a type of mechanistic rationality associated with Newtonian science and mathematics. All of these contributed to a problem-solving approach to organizational methods and matters, whether they were a matter of the constitution, as in the notion of a balanced constitution and a balance of power for foreign policy, or whether they were a question of the actual mechanisms of new machines, most obviously the steam engine. So I think one has also got a set of attitudes, and one has got liquidity. In Britain, the capital markets are sophisticated. The very safety of them from government confiscation, and I think it's fair to say that British public finances in the 18th century, with the exception of the short-lived South Sea bubble, were more orderly, more predictable, and better for business than British public finances have been over the last 50 years. So a less arbitrary governmental stance on public finances encouraged an ability to borrow at low rates of interest. Rates of interest varied, but if you're thinking of government debt, for Britain it was often 3 to 4%. For France in the same period it was often 11%. There was a more predictable lending into economic activity, whether it was borrowing money for turnpikes or whether it was borrowing money for coal mines or for trade. And all of those ensured that you end up with a situation in which there is capital available to an extent that is not crowded out, as capital is today, by expenditure on social welfare, on health, on other aspects of social infrastructure, such as education, all of which may be meritorious, but all of which limit the availability of capital for economic activity, as does very high taxation. So the situation in the 18th century was very different to that. It was, if you like, a pro-business fiscality, all of which encouraged investment in those terms. Linked to that was low inflation, which again created a sense of the safety of investment. So what one has got is factors, both factors in terms of the broader context of society, a society which believed in the rule of law, a society which believed in contract, a society which did not believe in arbitrary government, and all of the, as it were, discussion about the social nature of law, that law was, as it more accessible to those who were better off than those who were poor, etc., etc. All the E.P. Thompson stuff on the hanging tree does not preclude or lessen these points about the fundamental economic benefit of the operation of the law and of justice in this period. Nor can the arguments that politics was not obviously fully democratic. Obviously, it would have been regarded as very odd if it had been fully democratic in that period. So obviously, an oligarchic nature of a representative system proved to match an inegalitarian distribution of wealth and assets and opportunity. So one has externalities. Then one has specific factors of production, notably coal, which was far more important than the wealth derived from sugar and the slave trade. All of those are significant. But also, I think one needs to focus on and discuss the way in which, while explaining all these advantages, we also need to note, as I suggested at the very outset, that there were factors that limited these advantages. Longevity was precarious. The communication systems were affected by bad weather to an extent that you would not get by, let us say, 1890. There was a lack of predictability in manufacturing processes, and as yet only limited amount of what we would subsequently call the economies of scale attendant on mass production. So all of the factors that we are talking about played a role, but none of them yet reached what one might call a later breakout stage. That does not mean we should criticize the character of the economy in the first half of the 18th century. And when Wesley was a young man, there were already significant qualitative and quantitative changes, and he would have been aware of them. Every individual steam engine was a vote for change, an investment in new capability. Every individual turnpike was significant, even if a national network didn't emerge till the middle decades of the 18th century. And with steam engines, even if it was the case that by the end of the 18th century, you're talking about roughly 2,300. Despite that, that's 2,300 more than you had got at the beginning. And the significance of these was also in terms of attitudes. The attitudes that the British were showing were attitudes in which there was more of a willingness to consider change. The rate of the issue of patents rose from the late 1750s. So a society that, while having many respects that we would call conservative, and that's still an appropriate phrase for many of its aspects, nevertheless, in terms of agricultural, transport, industrial and financial wherewithal and activity, practice and ethos, it ceased to be so reverential to and reverential of the past as it had been hitherto, and increasingly was willing to embrace new outcomes and new possibilities. That is the real nature of what one might call the British Enlightenment. It is an explicit engagement with the possibility of change, with rationality seen as a crucial way to measure or assess opportunity. From that, there was no going back. Britain, within 50 years of Wesley's death, was very clearly the most potent economy in the world. At the time that he died, it was already by far the leading mercantile state in the world. These were major achievements. What is interesting from our point of view is now that we have lost this achievement, now that we are no longer an economy of such consequence, one sees people picking at the achievements of that period, ignoring the role of coal and emphasizing the role of sugar and slavery as a classic instance, or focusing on social cruelties, disadvantages, harshnesses of the situation, instead of noting the extent to which industrialization and other aspects of economic transformation were to lift large numbers out of poverty and create the possibility of conceptualizing a new world.
Jeremy, thank you very much, because I think that raises some fascinating questions and ideas about Wesley's own activities. To go back to the very beginning, your point about how modest in some cases these revolutions were in the 18th century and how they're very much functions and products of the 19th century. Agriculture is perhaps one of those most significant in Wesley's life, because it's quite clear that Wesley was not very well received in many agricultural societies or economies or economic areas. So in Hampshire, in Sussex, in some parts of Devon and Somerset, his initial ventures were not very successful. And it seems to me that these are economic areas in which the old systems are still retained quite a long way into the 18th century. Is that your reading, that there is a sort of natural conservatism in agricultural areas that we might have underestimated?
Yes, I think that that is a very fair point. I think that's an excellent point. And I would, what I would do is to argue that agriculture can be seen as both positive and negative. I think whatever, I think one's got to be careful that that's different standards, but I think that in a sense, there was often complaints, Arthur Young is a good example, about the conservatism of many of the how should one put it? There was often complaints about many of the people being unwilling to adopt new ideas. Yes. But the practicality was, I think, that you often can only assess the value of a new idea with caution. If you get it wrong, things are difficult. And there's only so much investment in new methods available. I think one's got to be aware of these problems.
Yes, certainly in terms of transport, Wesley clearly for the first half of his, well, actually more than that, until the 1770s, Wesley travels around almost exclusively on horseback, and really only gets to a position where he regards the roads as sufficiently stable and secure to use a chaise by the 1770s. So again, the road transport is emerging in this time rather than having popped up in 1700 with a complete road network. And we perhaps make a mistake if we don't see the 18th century as a period in which the turnpike and the transport improvements are only slowly coming upon the country.
Yes, absolutely. And particularly in the first 3 decades.
Yes, yes, absolutely. One aspect of industrialization, of course, is the process of urbanization. And it's quite clear that Wesley has an eye to the urban centres. The 3 great centres of Methodism, of course, are Bristol, Newcastle and London. And Wesley recognises the importance of the growing urban conurbations in those areas. And I think he's also clearly aware of opportunities presented by industrial economies. Kingswood miners in Bristol, Cornish miners, these are areas in which Methodism and evangelicalism more widely really take off in the 18th century. So the nature of the urban environment and the inability sometimes of the church to keep pace with the growth of the population that you mentioned is clearly one of the things that Wesley is able to take advantage of. And I guess ultimately that's a good example of Wesley's innovative approach, that he doesn't simply see the mission of evangelicalism as remaining within parishes.
Yes, I think that's right. He can sense what to a lot of commentators was less significant because they were focusing on politics. He, in a way, is more like Daniel Defoe, and in a sense, he understands in his religious mission Defoe's point about English society changing. And Defoe, of course, is writing in the mid-1720s. It's based on a tour around Britain. In fact, Defoe more correctly had made a number of visits to Britain, and he's reflecting that Wesley is reflecting this change. I mean, I was very struck recently by rereading the accounts of the Earl of Oxford's travels in the 1720s and 30s. And again, he is noticing change in places like Newcastle. And in many senses, what Wesley does is the classic argument, which was not, I mean, he's not unique in this, but was not pushed sufficiently, which is to say, here is a changing society. It needs a different ecclesiastical provision. This is important. And all of those are overlapping, but they're slightly different priorities. And he links them all together and captures the mood very early, a mood of, as you say, new urban centres, which have a vitality that could go in different directions.
Yes, one of the aspects that you touched on is the expansion of credit and finance. And that seems to me to be central to Wesley's mission, because, as you know, his financing of chapels is very much built on borrowed money. Sometimes it's built on large endowments from wealthy donors, but the vast majority of Methodist chapels are built from borrowings made by local meetings. And it seems to me that the availability of credit and the ability of people to rely on the fact that interest rates are stable and that there is a reliability in the flow of capital is something which enables Methodist meeting houses and then chapels to be built on a scale that really is quite remarkable in the 18th century.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, it reflects the availability of wood, plentiful availability of wood. It reflects the ability of labour at that skilled level and a free labour market. and it reflects the degree of liquidity, and it reflects the extent to which there is a willingness among those who are interested to spend the money on the matter.
My last comment, Jeremy, and I think this is an area where, again, you've raised it very helpfully, is Wesley's reliance, or Wesley's seeking of the opportunity to enhance an increasingly youthful population. You mentioned that the growth of the numbers of young people in the country is significant. The other demographic that Wesley appeals to, of course, is women. And there is surely some argument that women play a much more significant economic role in the 18th century than perhaps they had done in the 17th. Is that right, that there is a greater role for women in the 18th century, and therefore perhaps as part of a woman's sense that they can take control of their own spiritual destiny, they can also take control to some degree of their economic destiny?
To a degree, I'm not sure how that I'd be happy to see a description of women or men as an aggregate. I think there's enormous differences. What I would say is I think our understanding of family economics and family society means that we realize that behind what is often a masculine ethos, and indeed a paternalistic ethos, there was often a practice of cooperation, which one needs to be aware of and which was often significant.
Yes, I think that's right. One of the aspects of women's involvement in Methodism is the degree to which they are deciding on the purchasing of cheap magazines and some of the items that Wesley is producing. And just occasionally one gets a sense that Wesley is aware that women have spare money to spend, and that they are part of the market for some of his published items. But you're right, it's probably not right to press it too far in identifying a separate female economic market.
Yes, that's what I think, that would be the case. There are, interestingly enough, as you know, other newspapers, or magazines, not Wesleyan, that are specifically for women. And it's argued that, of course, some of the novels are very much focused on female readers. All I'm just saying is that I'm a bit wary of the argument that you can disaggregate society into men and women and then aggregate each of those reify each of those for analytical purposes. I think it's much more complex than that. But I certainly agree with you that Wesley is able to draw on a pattern of enthusiasm which often had been particularly attractive to those who felt excluded from the previous church practice.
Yes. Yes, Jeremy, thank you very much indeed. I think that's a very helpful way to look at the economic aspects of Wesley's world. So thank you again. Bye-bye.